Brandon Bassham directs and writes Bring on the Damned, a 5-story anthology movie where its raison d'etre is to have 5 different stories with an entirely different filming style for each film. So let's go through it. This is the low budget movie and it's actually put out by Troma, so expect some weirdness along the way. The first one is probably the most kind of straightforward story, although it ends with a kind of a little bit of a weird ending, kind of funny, but it effectively is a found footage style movie, and this focuses on a doctor who is brought in by the church to try and diagnose this woman who has been displaying weird behaviour, and they want to rule out any kind of medical issues before they start progressing with a exorcism. But this kind of doctor starts to wanting to kind of stay on even though she can't kind of explain some of the behaviours there. So this is a kind of a found footage kind of mockumentary style one, and it's quite sort of, it looks like it's shot on video, that type of thing. It's kind of quite low tech in some respects, but deliberately so. And like I said, this out of all of them is probably the one that's played the straightest, apart from the end scene, which comes out of nowhere because it is so sort of straight until that point. For the most part, there's a couple of sillier elements, but for the most part, it's relatively sort of straight. And then it ends with this kind of like this joke moment, which is kind of funny, I have to say. But being this, because this one is the one that is played kind of the straightest, so to speak, you're a little bit more involved in regard to the actual sort of plot and the setup here. And there's been plenty of kind of found footage exorcism films, to be sure, and this is another one. But like I said, I think it's fine. I mean, it kind of very much plays like a kind of found footage mockumentary. But it's not a bad little kind of like low budget kind of exorcism movie. And then the kind of the cherry on top is the kind of the final scene of the movie where it kind of goes a little bit bananas and reminds you that this is a Troma film. I kind of quite liked this one, and it's a little bit of an enjoyable horror one, which does feel a little bit like a horror movie, even though it does have its tongue in cheek. I quite like that first one. The second one, and this is out of all of them before I watched it, this was the one I thought, I'm not going to like this one, because it's in the style of FrenchNew Wave cinema, and I was like, I have no interest in that. However, I actually kind of found the story quite charming, and it's actually about 2 different serial killers who end up committing a variety of murders each, and they sort of both sort of target women, and they actually kind of become friends, and it's all going tickety-boo until they both end up wanting to target the same woman and kind of be a little bit competitive towards who gets the prize, so to speak. And that kind of premise I felt was a fun one. And then we have these visual stylings of this kind of, as I say, this French New Wave cinema. Some of the kind of the dialogue is spoken in kind of French, I'm presuming. And yeah, I actually kind of surprisingly quite enjoyed it. This one I would say actually was the most punchy in regards to its pacing. And that's a criticism I'll have of some of the other ones here, is that the pacing is maybe a little on the kind of the slow side or something, but not in this one. And I actually found this one quite charming, I have to say, and quite a neat, fun idea. And the concept of these two sort of dueling serial killers who see each other initially as kind of kindred spirits, but ultimately end up in competition with another. Quite fun, and it's all black and white and stuff like that. And there's some kind of techniques that are kind of reminiscent of, as I say, French New Wave cinema. So I actually kind of quite like this one, I have to say. The third one is I believe it's meant to be like a De Palma-esque style kind of thriller. And this one focuses on this woman who cannot get any pleasure from sex. So she's really seeing a psychiatrist who's trying to kind of treat her, and she ends up kind of going to meet all these men, and they're all just wanting to kind of get laid and all of this, and in cheap bars and everything. She ends up killing one and finds out that she actually gets turned on by killings. This follows her on a kind of string of different kind of murders, killing these various kind of like guys in clubs until she meets the Disco King. And, he's the guy who is, worried that this kind of serial killer is now putting off people going to the disco. But he is the Disco King and has these sweet moves. And maybe that will save him. Again, it's a somewhat of a fun pitch. And in his play, semi-straight. I mean, I guess the idea here of a serial killer being sort of... their reason for doing it was to get sexual gratification. It's probably somewhat true to life in regards to some serial killer numbers here, but it's kind of played with this kind of cheesy sort of 70s sort of styles, complete with kind of like Saturday Night Fever style disco scenes. It's a fun idea. I think this one is one of the ones that does suffer a little bit from pacing. And I think the dramatic elements would have been more effective had they been played a little bit more dramatically. This one does suffer from looking a little on the cheap side at times. And I think if it's trying to have this De Palma style thriller, it needed to be a little bit more thrilling, and it doesn't really. It's a fun enough concept, but I think this is one where it could have been treated a little bit straighter, and then maybe just have these kind of random sort of disco numbers in, and I think it may have been a little bit more effective. But the acting's a little weak in this one, maybe even deliberately so. It's okay, but like I said, I think it sort of outstays its welcome. Ultimately, you find you're just following this woman doing very much the same thing a lot of the time. Meeting men, and a lot of it's done in montage, admittedly. It was all right, but like I say, I think this one had scope for being better. I think if they had lent into more of a dramatic style and then juxtapose it with some kind of like sweet-ass disco scenes, that would have been the way to go for me in this one. But it doesn't. It always seems a little bit hokey at times. Again, it is a Troma movie, but I think it loses some of the kind of the funness if it had these two polar opposite sort of styles of like kind of 70s like grittiness on one side, but then you have like sort of disco scenes on the other, and it all kind of never really feels all that dissimilar in a way. So it was okay. The fourth one to me was the weakest, and this is a kind of noir style film where a detective is set on a case, and this one kind of involves aliens from Mars that appear as kind of like glowing orbs. I found this one incredibly dull. It's trying to be this kind of moody noir sort of style film, and have these kind of long drawn out sort of moody pieces and stuff like that. And some of the kind of the cinematography is quite fun and is reminiscent of kind of film noir and stuff. So I do think in a way it does sort of capture that, but it's just not interesting. And again, it has this sort of goofy idea about these kind of Martians that just kind of communicate in sort of squeaks and things. I don't know. This one didn't work for me. I was actually just like, oh, please end. It was dragging, and I was just like, please end this one. This one was by far and away the weakest, if you ask me. And then the final one, which I feel is probably going to be the most memorable and certainly the most wacky, but in a way that's what makes this one fun, is it has like a Hanna-Barbera feel to it. So we have like a violent serial killer who's called the Butt Killer or something, and he basically kills people through sodomizing them, and it's pretty gruesome, and it's kind of like a Seven sort of style serial killer where we have these police detectives so disgusted by these crimes that they call in a Josie and the Pussycat style kind of cartoon style investigation team called Tara and the Tigers or something, who are this kind of like a quartet of pop band and part-time musicians, and they are just kind of like goofy, sort of half the time just singing along rather than doing any investigating, in full on kind of like, you know, tiger leotards and things like that, just doing songs and treating it all like it's like a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. I should point out this is all live action, it's not an animated one. And that is just like, you know, again, having that real juxtaposition between a very sick and depraved serial killer and then have these really goofy elements. I think this is what makes this one so memorable, which I think maybe could have been a similar sort of thing in the kind of the De Palma style one, which that was more of a middle of the road, didn't quite work. Whilst this one, you know, I mean, it is all played for a little bit of a kind of a goof. But I think this one, because of that, it does kind of work. It ends up being quite fun. But it is a one-joke film, this one. And I do feel, you know, it does kind of end up, okay, you've watched the joke, and it is fun, and it is funny having up these characters go like jinkies and that kind of thing, and then kind of doing the sort of like the running around like you do in the cartoons. But you feel like, okay, we don't need like a big long section of this one. Maybe I think as a general critique, it could have been shortened. Maybe they could have had a sixth film and then just had them shorter, or just had a shorter runtime in general. Because I do feel the pacing is probably overall the biggest kind of critique here. But what this movie does have is a lot of variety. Each film very, very different in its stylistic choices, and that's the whole point of this film, is it's having 5 vastly different movies that are all kind of quite goofy in their own right. They all have goofy elements, but they're all very different in the kind of the film styles and stuff, which makes it probably the most varied anthology movie you're ever going to see, because of that. And it is a fun one. Some work better than others. I do think it would have benefited, I'd say, from having a more serious tone in some, and then maybe not in others, if that makes sense. So I do think there was a little bit of way this movie could have been improved. But overall, it's a fun, goofy movie. It is very low budget. But I think if you just want some pure B-movie schlock, and you like variety, if that's the spice of your life, then I would check it out. I'll give it a 6 out of 10 because I do think it's very creative, and you know, I'll give it props to that. It is low budget. If you're not a fan of low budget movies, maybe this isn't going to be the one. But yeah, I still had quite a lot of fun with it, so it's a 6 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? Would you see it? Please do let me know your thoughts, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.